When his carer learnt of it, the wealthy man told him, "If something happens to me, don't tell my family." The hospital was silent except for the faint hum of medical monitors, which is why he phoned the cops. 75-year-old Walter Johnson gazed out of the huge window of the room. His trembling hands lay on the white sheets as the weight of the IV hung, lost in the gray city sky. Walter felt the chill of the hospital's sterile air emanating from his arm. His heart, a sense of isolation that stemmed from the emotional emptiness that had engulfed him for years past. Yet despite his fatigue, his mind continued to wander, recalling his childhood. When he was a young, ambitious man, he worked hard and dedicatedly to develop his financial empire, felt that his success would guarantee his family's well-being and that he did everything for them. But he now realized how mistaken he had been in what was likely the latter period of his life. Santiago and Robert Angel, his children, had formerly been his greatest pride, gave him the motivation to keep going in spite of the difficulties. But he eventually observed their ambition and avarice had taken over, causing them to distance themselves from what Walter couldn't even recall the last time he experienced sincere affection from any of them during their visits. Had grown thin, icy, and filled with a sense of duty, and was now resting in this. He waited in his hospital bed for a visit, but the door never opened. Walter was startled out of his reverie and looked up, expecting to see one of his kids, but instead he saw a young man he was pulling a cart full of medical equipment, wearing a nurse's outfit, and his serene face and alert eyes came in. As the young man approached to check the monitors, he said quietly and professionally, "How are you feeling today, Johnson?" Walter looked at him coldly from the bed. He had spent so much time with people acting as though they cared. When the nurse realized he had no more expectations, she started rearranging the heart monitor cables without waiting for a. Despite being used to his patient's lack of interest, Walter couldn't help but observe him more. Upon closer inspection, he noticed something unique in this young man that he didn't detect in Walter. Finally broke the silence by muttering, "Others, I've had better days." The young man's name was Andrew, and he nodded and smiled slightly as though he knew more than what was said. Despite his youthful appearance, Walter noticed a certain serenity in him, as though life had already imparted some difficult lessons. As he checked the IV, Andrew remarked, "It's normal to feel that way, but if you need anything, just let me know." Walter stared. How easily Andrew operated the medical equipment, but it wasn't his expertise that took his attention, but rather that this young man didn't have the calculating, vacuous expression Walter had come to recognize in others around him. Distinct, there was no sense that Andrew recognized him as anything more than a wealthy elderly man who was going to lose everything. Andrew worked in the room where Walter lost in quiet for several minutes. He recalled that the last time his kids had been to see him, it had been for a meeting rather than out of love or worry. Robert, his oldest, had been the most adamant, under the pretext of sympathy, that day unable to conceal his ambitions when discussing his businesses and quietly pleading with Walter to relinquish control. Despite being physically there, Angel was absorbed in her own world and had the empty expression of someone who was about to. Santiago, his youngest son, had not even bothered to show up. And self-destruction, they no longer care about me. Walter realized that he was only a barrier in their eyes as he watched the day get darker outside the window. More than any disease that might ravage him, the thought of them and their legacy tore at him. Walter abruptly broke the stillness by asking, "Do you have family?" as he glanced at Andrew. To appear out of nowhere, but Walter needed to know if anyone in the world still recognized the importance of family ties, or if everyone was destined to turn on their loved ones in order to obtain money. Andrew was taken aback by after a little delay, the query was understandably replied, "Not much, Mr. Johnson. I've learned to survive on my own since my mother and father went away a few years ago." Walter found great resonance in the reaction. It was the same emptiness and loneliness, the same sense of alienation from people who ought to have loved you the most, which may be why something about Walter felt a little less alone when Andrew recognized something. He completed his task quietly, but before he left the room, he turned back to Walter. "If you ever need to chat, I'll stay close and don't be afraid to inquire." Walter nodded slowly and silently as the door closed behind Andrew the elderly. The man found himself alone with his thoughts once more, but this time he was aware that the loneliness wasn't as terrible. At least there was someone close by who appeared to understand him, even if only little, regardless of what the future contained. Day turned to night, and for the first time in a long time, Walter felt a tiny nudge as he closed his eyes to sleep. Glimmer of optimism. Perhaps he was not completely. Walter's hospital room was illuminated by the morning sun alone, casting long, even though the day had started for him. Shadows on the white walls felt like an infinite continuation of the night before. Walter, feeling lonely and cold, had requested that one of the nurses inform his family about his condition and the significance of visiting him, but regardless of how dire the situation is, the only answer he had so far only been quiet as the elderly man sank into the pillows. Although hardly provided him with any solace, he recalled the times when his family showed him kindness before money, and power dominated them at the time, so Robert asked him for business angel counsel. Santiago followed him around with admiration when he arrived on a regular basis merely to talk, but those days were so far away that they now appeared to be memories of a past life. The sound of the corridor broke his for a little minute. Walter gave himself a glimmer of optimism that someone might be approaching in his room. When his kids finally made the decision to arrive, he sat up a little in bed and tried to conceal his joy within. The door opened with an attitude of indifference, but a doctor with a clipboard came in place of a familiar face. A knot formed in Walter's stomach, and the hope immediately disappeared. The doctor, Mr. Johnson, gave him a polite greeting in the morning and went over the reports and monitors. "We'll be conducting some regular testing today to track your progress, so there isn't much to worry about right now." Walter nodded silently. Walter's mind strayed back to his kids as the doctor went about his operation, wondering whether they truly didn't care, even enough for a brief visit to see if he was still alive. He was aware of the response, but he didn't want to acknowledge that he was merely a barrier preventing them from achieving what they believed to be their right. After completing his examination, the doctor left the room, leaving Walter alone. He had spent a lifetime building once more. The minutes turned into hours in the all-too-familiar solitude, and the Walter had waited for hours on end in the hopes that at least one of his kids would show up. But when the afternoon came, he was by alone as the sun started to drop on the horizon. The door opened once more, and Walter didn't look up this time. The sound of footfall was constant and light, but he didn't want to raise his expectations again. Didn't identify any of his family members in the pattern. "How is your day going, Mr. Johnson?" Walter moaned, his voice growing more exhausted. It was Andrew, the young nurse who had been seeing to him for the past few days. Then he had planned, as if yesterday, and Andrew was by himself with his typical composure. Started to examine the monitors as efficiently as always, but this time the room was quieter than usual. Could sense Walter's anguish, which was evident in something more than his physical condition. Walter abruptly broke the silence when I asked the nurses, "Deeper, you know. I told my family that I was in bad condition because I believed maybe that word might attract them, but it appears that they don't find it sufficient." After a brief delay, Andrew approached Walter's bed. He didn't have to be a doctor to realize that Walter's sickness was impacting not only his physical health, but also his spiritual well-being. He remained there and listened, even though he didn't have much to say, since he understood that sometimes what people needed most wasn't words but companionship. Walter gazed at Andrew and appeared to consider for a time whether or to stop talking, but then, as though something in the young nurse's eyes given him the confidence he required, he started to open. "When you're young, you think that everything you do is for your family, and you know that you put in a lot of effort and sacrifice time. You believe that they understand how much you value their pleasure, yet one day you acknowledge that they no longer care about you and only regard you as a resource to help them achieve their own goals." Andrew nodded slowly, but not about who you are or what you can offer them, because he had personally gone through it, but also because he could sense Walter's suffering in every syllable. Walter, my oldest son, took a moment to swallow the lump in his throat. "Used to like and respect me, but now all I see in his eyes is ambition. And don't get me wrong, it's the kind of ambition that's ruining him rather than the kind that makes him better. He no longer views me as a father and is only interested in controlling my businesses." The room collapsed into a huge silence, followed by Angel. Walter's sighed, "Which is so consumed by her addictions that I can't. When she last saw me in the eyes, I can't recall if she still has the same perspective on the world or if it's all blurred for her." But he paused once more as though discussing his kids would be too painful. "But there, Santiago." There was still much to say. As though discussing him caused him even more pain, Santiago. Walter's voice grew softer. Always the most charming of the three, but he was captivated by gambling and the bets. Knows I have nothing more to offer, so he doesn't even beg for aid anymore. He's so indebted. I wonder. Walter let his head drop back into the cushions, letting go of all the air, if he had any chance of escaping. During his confession, Andrew gazed at Walter with a mixture of regret and empathy in his eyes. He knew there were no words that could make the hurt of a life full of betrayals go away, yet he chose to remain silent. Also understood that sometimes being there was all that could be done, so he remained silent by the bed. Letting the elderly after what seemed like an eternity, a man felt that he wasn't entirely alone. I expected one of them would arrive, but Walter spoke again, this time in a whispery tone, at least to act as though they are concerned today, but he didn't even glance at Andrew with weary eyes, but with a secret prayer in them. I occasionally question whether everything I've done and everything I've accomplished was for nothing. Feeling obligated to comfort him, Andrew occasionally talked quietly. The worth of anything we create lies not in what other people do with it, but rather in what we did to get there. You put a lot of effort into your... Nobody can take that away from you, family, for what you felt was right. Walter observed him for a while, allowing those words to sink into his consciousness. He wasn't sure if they made him feel better, or if they only made him feel more depressed. But for the first time, Andrew stayed for a few more minutes fixing the monitors and making sure that someone was present to listen. Everything was in order, but he stopped at the door before leaving to give Walter one final glance. "I'll be back." Walter nodded appreciatively, "But I'll be listening if you need to talk tomorrow." He didn't say it out as Andrew walked out of the room where the elderly guy was lying and gazing at the ceiling. The long-awaited visit had not materialized, but unexpectedly the light completely vanished, giving way to the night, and he no longer felt as alone as he had earlier in the day. Walter continued to wait for his kids, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to see them anymore. After hearing the sound of Walter could only hear tires on the soggy streets outside his window, which precisely represented the weather. His gray, dreary demeanor was characterized by a persistent. While in the seclusion of his hospital room, Walter began to feel increasingly imprisoned, not only because of his physical condition, but due to the psychological burden of realizing that people who ought to be beside him had deserted. He received no messages or calls from his kids. Little, and as the days passed, Walter started to consider how death would be a relief and a means of escaping the never-ending feeling of betrayal that held him captive. But a tiny flame lingered. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps it was the glimmering hope that something or someone would alter the situation he was in. It was one of those gloomy days when the door slowly opened, and Andrew, wheeling in the cart of medical supplies, he entered the room with his customary composure, and his presence immediately felt like a reprieve from Walter's life's routine. The elderly man had started to observe that Andrew's presence, despite its silence, gave him some consolation. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson Andrew," he said as he started looking over. The Walter nodded with his customary professionalism, but he didn't answer right away since something inside of him had altered since their previous conversation, and he couldn't deny the notion that Andrew had changed. Even though he was young, Andrew displayed a level of maturity and calm that Walter hadn't seen in a while, not even in his own toddlers. After completing his inspection of the equipment, Andrew stopped to watch Walter for a bit, and saw something in his eyes showed fatigue that sprang from a profound emotional trauma as much as his physical condition. "How are you feeling?" Andrew inquired today out of real concern and not just as part of his work. Walter considered what he wanted to say as he stared at him, and then he sighed and made the decision to be honest today. Just like Andrew stepped a little closer, as he always responded in a quiet, empty voice. Sensing that Walter had more to say, he sat down in the chair next to the bed and made a motion. After a few moments of silence, Walter remarked, "You know, Andrew, I appreciate it. Many things that once seemed unimportant become clear as you reach my age, and you understand that time doesn't just take away your health, but everything you believe to be significant, including respect from others and family." Andrew nodded, continuing to look at Walter, and I reasoned that after everything I had done for them, for my wife's children would be here with me. But now I realized that it was always more about what they could gain from me than what I did for them. And now that I have nothing, Walter's voice was filled with sadness, and Andrew had never heard such a clear indication that they no longer cared about me. Shocking and devastating admission, but it was Walter's delivery that affected him the most. Robert Walter spoke about his appointment with a profound sense of disappointment, but without bitterness or anger. "Oh, he used to be unique, you know. He had goals and ideas that I thought he was great, but somewhere along the line he became overly ambitious. And now he is concerned with what he can receive from me. It seems as though I have already passed away." Walter hesitated, straining to suppress the feelings that were about to explode. Andrew, not knowing what to say, just kept quiet, letting Walter in order to continue. "My daughter Angel drowned in her own troubles. She's a woman who became addicted, and I can't even hold her entirely responsible because I was never enough for her. Perhaps I'm to blame for everything that's going on. Perhaps I've failed as a, at last, father." Andrew said in a stern but gentle tone, "I don't think it's your fault, Mr. Johnson. Occasionally people make decisions that are beyond our control, no matter how, for a brief period." Walter gazed at him, as though those words were true, despite all the suffering he was experiencing. It was reassuring to hear Andrew's voice, as though it served as a reminder that not all was "yeah, perhaps you're correct," Walter acknowledged, although his expression remained dejected. "However, that doesn't change the fact that Santiago and I are left alone in the end. Despite being stuck in debt from gaming, my youngest son seems to care enough to come visit. Everything I've done for them seems to have been in vain, and his life is a complete mess." Andrew gave Walter a confused glance. He was aware that what he was listening to wasn't only an elderly man venting, but rather it must be hard for someone to feel that way after losing all they previously held dear. Walter nodded slowly as Andrew stated, "Knowing you've done so much yet things still didn't turn out as you hoped." Then challenging Andrew, "It's heartbreaking, and I feel like my life has been a horrible joke that I committed to them, my loved ones, and now that I am near death, they are not present. They don't care." The room grew quieter, and Walter shut as Andrew stayed at his side for a minute, as though the words he had just spoken had sapped all of his remaining energy. Letting the elderly man analyze his feelings without moving, Walter eventually opened his eyes and turned to face Andrew, looking tired, but yet a little relieved to be sharing. I guess he smiled weakly as he stated, "I don't know why I'm telling you all this, because it was so intimate." Andrew smiled softly. "And sometimes speaking to someone who isn't involved is exactly what I wanted to say." Walter nodded and felt the weight on his shoulders for the first time in days. His chest lifted, even if only little. "Thank you, Andrew," he whispered. Hardly more than a whisper for constant listening, Mr. Johnson Andrew quietly replied, "I'm here for whatever you need." Walter observed him silently there was a time when it seemed like someone was attempting to figure out what made Andrew so unique from everyone else. Regarding the young nurse who made Walter think of his own father, a strong, honorable man who had always supported. "You know Andrew Walter? He was wealthy and successful long before such things entered his life." Said, "You remind me a lot of my father, who was a simple man," after a long silence. "I don't know what your life has been like, but it has an inner strength that I didn't quite get until I lost him." Although he didn't express it, Andrew was taken aback by the comparison, suggesting that you also faced your own challenges. Even so, his reaction was straightforward. "Mr. Johnson, we all have challenges, but," Walter grinned, "what matters is that we keep going forward even when things get tough." I nodded slightly in agreement with his statement. "You're right, and I appreciate you reminding me of that, even though they didn't express it in words." Their relationship had become closer, and Andrew Walter had discovered someone he could rely on, someone who looked at him with genuine respect and compassion instead of ambition or greed, and the day went on. But for the first time in a long time, something had changed, and Walter felt less alone, even though he had discovered in Andrew something far more precious than any worldly wealth, a true human being, after his family had deceived him. For Walter, the hospital was a labyrinth of silent corridors and muffled echoes. It seemed like the same thing was happening in that room every day: stillness, alone, and more. He had ceased waiting for visits in solitude, believing that hope had transformed into resignation. And he was aware that even if, although it wasn't for him, his family did turn there to see what they could get from him. It was a dreary day. One of those. Walter lay in his bed, his body tearing, but his spirit seemed to be crushed. Thinking actively about the discussions he had just had he was still baffled by Andrew's apparent interest for his well-being, despite having no duty to him. Better health than his own kids, but the sound of the door opening jolted him out of his reverie. Walter saw his oldest son approach quickly, but his expression was anxious. "Dad," Robert murmured in a strained voice as his kid paced the room with anxious intensity, almost as if he couldn't remain motionless. Trying to hide his genuine motivations behind a facade of compassion, Walter glanced at him without feeling. He had come to distrust the good words of his son Robert, the man he had previously admired and trusted completely. He now appeared to be focused on only one thing: command of the family companies, like a man anticipating the inevitable. Walter answered with a tinge of sarcastically. He fixed his gaze on Robert and asked, "How are you?" Robert paused for a moment. After considering what his father had said, he realized that Walter was no longer the easily he was a manipulated man years ago, but he made an effort to keep up his act. "I'm busy, you know the enterprises. the issues, but I came because I'm worried about you, Dad. He claimed that lately, I've been getting closer to the bed. Considering the possibility that it's time for you to cease worrying so much about the companies I could assist you with, Walter grinned. But it wasn't an expression of appreciation for the items you shouldn't be carrying anymore. It was one of comprehension. He understood Robert's true nature and knew his son too well. Desired, and it wasn't to relieve his burden of, certainly, assist me, Walter. I've been thinking the same thing, Robert, and I think it might be time to delegate, but I'm not sure if you're the appropriate person to assume that duty. Robert scowled, but promptly fixed his phrase. Why do you claim that? I've always been there for you. In your business endeavors, I simply want to know what's best for you and the family. Walter's recurrent anguish was obvious. Robert, the family member who never comes to see me, the one who's more concerned with what they inherit than with my personal identity, as the one who acts concerned while plotting to steal. Robert attempted to reply to what I still had left, when the door suddenly opened. Once more, Angel's sister entered with shaky legs and unfocused eyes, as though she was unable to focus on anything but her own inner turmoil. So Gabriel, her partner, followed her with his customary, the dishonest attorney, who was usually involved in the family's most sinister activities, placed himself next to. However, Angel quietly took charge of the situation by saying, "Hello, Dad." She sat in a chair next to the bed and hardly gave him a look because her tone was lacking. Walter swayed slightly as he glanced at his daughter. His tragic Angel, who had his happy little kid, was now caught in a vicious circle of self-destruction and unable to break free from her addiction to. She was a shadow of the person she used to be due to drugs and Gabriel's manipulation. Other hand was fully present, seeing every action, and he smiled politely as he walked up to Walter. "Mr. Johnson," he responded in his usual icy tone. "It's good to see you in relatively good health." Walter was slow to react because he knew that Gabriel was the most deadly of them all. This man had witnessed an Angel had a chance to approach the Johnson riches, and Walter was most concerned that his daughter didn't even understand that she was being taken advantage of. "How lucky I am," Walter remarked ironically. With so much love and care from his family, Gabriel remained calm, but Robert started to mature. Things weren't going as planned, and Robert was growing more and more impatient, attempting to convey that Gabriel interrupted, as though he were in charge of the discussion, and that this circumstance must be quite stressful for you, so you should give us time to manage your affairs. Could make complicated decisions harder for you, and we want to make sure everything is in order. Walter, hearing those words, made his blood freeze in his veins, confirming his suspicions about Gabriel and the robbers' actual motivations were verified at that precise moment that they intended to legally incapacitate him, in addition to merely obtaining his wealth. Him seize total authority over his companies and give the impression that they cared about his well-being. "Oh, of course, all for my well-being," Walter said, stifling the rage that was building within of him. Desperate to take back control, Robert came up and said, "Dad, we only want what's best for you. You can't handle anything on your own any longer. It's time to put your trust in us." Walter gave him a solemn glance as though he were seeing him for the first time, when it happened for the first time. It was astounding how the man who had once been his biggest pride had become someone who was prepared to deceive his own father in order to obtain money. "Don't worry about me, Walter." Robert pinched his lips together in frustration, but he was unable to push any buttons when he eventually replied, "I'll find a way to handle things." Gabriel, who was always more calculated, just watched the scene with a mysterious smile. He was aware that while this wasn't the ideal time to carry out their plan, it would happen eventually. The family departed the room after a few more awkward minutes of talking, leaving Walter alone once more, but this time, instead of being overcome by solitude, he felt increasingly determined. He realized that he couldn't rely on his family, but Andrew was the only person who seemed to take care of him later that day as Walter, without expecting anything in return. After processing everything that had transpired, Andrew returned to the chamber, and this time Walter gave him a newfound clarity, pulled the young nurse to his side and said, "I need to ask you, I can't trust anyone else, Walter," Andrew said, approaching Walter attentively and uncertain of what he would say. He went on in a serious tone, saying, "If something were to happen to me, I want you to take care of everything. You are the one person I can trust, Andrew, so don't let my family get away with their intentions." Andrew was shocked by Walter's ferocity, but he nodded, realizing the gravity of what he was being asked to undertake. "For the first time in weeks, Mr. Johnson, I will do all in my power to prevent anything from happening." With Andrew's assistance, Walter understood he wasn't fighting this battle alone, and that he could overcome whatever, even if the shadow of treachery still hovered over him. The tone in the room transformed as Walter arrived. An ally, someone he could rely on, and he understood the true battle as darkness fell. It was only getting started when the morning mist gradually dissipated, letting a dappled sun enter Walter's chamber. Although the day appeared to be calm, the old man's heart was pounding uneasily following his family's visit. Something inside of him had changed, and the final curtain of his delusion regarding his kids' love had dropped. More than the stark and tragic reality struck him when he realized they were hoping for his death rather than his recovery. Walter felt worn out from exerting a force he could no longer control, not just emotionally and physically spent. Every thought was labored, and every action was heavy. Into the shadowy recesses of his mind, the recollections of his childhood, when his kids were young and idolized him. Admiration mixed with the ambition and harshness he had recently noticed in their eyes, wondering how he had failed so as a father. How had they become individuals who valued money more than as he struggled with these issues about familial love? The sound of the door opening disturbed the stillness, and Andrew stepped inside. Even though he was discreet, his normal calm demeanor while wheeling the medical cart always appeared to add a little calm to Walter's inner turmoil. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson." "Andrew." "Good morning," Andrew Walter replied with his customary civility as he went to check the monitors. However, his tone was Andrew, who is always perceptive, noticed right once that Walter's tone had changed from just a whisper to one that was softer and more defeated than normal, but he kept going about his duties, fixing the wires and monitoring the IV without saying anything. After a few minutes of awkward silence, he kept his eyes focused on Walter, waiting for him to be ready to talk. Andrew let out a long sigh and broke off. "I want to ask you something." Andrew set the monitor aside and paused, realizing that whatever Walter was about to say wasn't just a routine request. Approached the bed and knelt next to Walter, being as composed as ever. Walter stared at him with a mixture of pity in his eyes. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here for whatever you need." Andrew had never witnessed such terror and a sense of helplessness before. "My family, some people are untrustworthy." Walter acknowledged his resentment while constricting his throat. "Are only interested in what I leave behind, Andrew, not in whether I live or die. They only care about my money and businesses." Nodded slowly without interjecting. He had observed Walter's kids' coldness on earlier trips, but he was more seriously affected than he had anticipated by the old man's straightforward confession. "I know," Robert and Walter added. "Gabriel is planning something. I don't know the specifics, but I sense they want to render me incapable of doing anything. Create the impression that I'm unable of making judgments anymore, so they may seize all I own." And Angel Walters, for a brief moment, her voice broke. "She's not the daughter I know. She's lost in her own issues and isn't really aware of what's going on around her." Andrew briefly lowered his sight to digest. He felt both resentment and sympathy for the elderly man, as Walter explained to him how someone with such authority, might, and achievement be so totally alone during his most trying times. "I recognize what Mr. Johnson," Andrew stated quietly. "I've observed their actions and behavior. I'm very sorry you had to endure this." Walter briefly closed his eyes. He inhaled deeply as though gathering the courage to speak, and when he opened them again, his eyes were unwavering. Andrew, in spite of his frailty, stated this time in a more distinct tone, "If something happens to you," said, "I don't want you to tell my family." As if it were the weight of Walter's plea to keep it a secret hit Andrew hard, as he felt the air grow heavier in the still water. Walter nodded as Andrew inquired incredulously, "I don't want them to find out, at least not. My family is there for what I can offer them, not for me until it's too late for them to take any action, and they will simply use my death as a chance to seize power, Andrew. Don't want to be handled like just another commercial deal." Andrew said nothing while trying to find the appropriate, although he was aware of Walter's dire circumstances. He hadn't expected this kind of plea magnitude, but he recognized the gravity in Walter's eyes and realized that this was a man's last option when he had no other options. "I understand, Mr. Johnson," Andrew stated in a grave tone. "I'll comply with your request." Walter sighed in relief, as even though the elderly guy didn't express it, he understood that if at least a tiny portion of the weight he was carrying had been removed. "You're a decent man," Andrew Walter remarked, his voice softening, giving Andrew a trust he hadn't had in years. "And I apologize for putting you in this predicament. I shouldn't have asked for this, but I can't trust." Andrew shook his head and said, "If you don't have anything to apologize for, I'll do it." For a moment, They both kept quiet about the seriousness of what had happened, no matter what it takes to make sure your wishes are honored. Simply happened. Andrew didn't need to say anything more to realize that he now carried a duty that extended well beyond his duties as a nurse. In addition to tending to Walter's physical needs, he was also protecting Andrew's legacy and dignity in his last moments before departing the room. Turned to Walter. Rest for a moment. Mr. Johnson, I'll see to everything. Walter gazed at him appreciatively, and even though he remained silent, his eyes conveyed the faith he had placed in Andrew. Closed his eyes slowly, allowing a moment of calm to sweep over him. However, Andrew exited the room with the burden of responsibility on his shoulders for the first time in weeks. Shoulders. He realized that he would be a man's quiet guardian from that point on, who, aside from his own dignity, had lost everything that had formerly mattered to him. The hospital's empty hallways and flickering lights were covered in a shroud of stillness as darkness fell over the city, made the atmosphere seem darker than normal to Andrew, and his firm steps. But ever since he spoke with Walter that morning, a persistent uneasiness had distracted him from his regular tasks. Rang in his mind the old man's advice to keep my family in the dark if something were to happen to me. Andrew had taken on the duty without hesitation, and it was loaded with meaning. Yet he now understood that there was much more at risk than a straightforward request, especially from Walter's family. Robert and Gabriel were plotting something much more terrible than simple greed or indifference. Andrew was more convinced that something sinister was preventing him from doing nothing, occurring, and before it was too late that evening, he had to find out the truth. Andrew knew he couldn't do this alone, but he also knew that it was time to act after completing his rounds. Who he could rely on. Therefore, he rode the lift to the ground floor, instead of going to the typical break room, where one of the few individuals in the hospital with whom he had a genuine friendship was Lauren. A physician his own age was the ideal ally in this case, because she was not only an accomplished doctor, but also had a strong sense of justice. When Andrew arrived at the emergency room, he discovered Lauren looking over some files, but she was concentrating on her work. When she saw Andrew, she looked up and smiled slightly. "What are you doing here at this hour?" she questioned in a tone that disclosed that she had a feeling something wasn't right, and Andrew quickly sat across from her. From her, summarizing all that Walter had informed him that morning and outlining his developing, Lauren scowled as Andrew spoke uneasily, raising concerns about the plot in which Robert and Gabriel were participating. While processing the facts, she twirled a pen between her fingers. "Are you certain there?" she finally asked in a whisper, tweaking the treatments. "I don't have hard evidence, but Walter is correct about something seems really odd." And Andrew retorted that Gabriel is a corrupt person. "Walter told me that he believes the lawyer and Robert are determined to seize control of the family enterprises, diminishing him, and I don't believe it's merely paranoia." Lauren nodded slowly, her eyes full of she was worried since she understood that in the world of large corporations and enormous riches, these kinds of circumstances weren't totally unusual, but it still astounded her to see how wealth and influence could set a family against one another. "I'll go into more detail. Examine his medical records." Lauren ultimately stated that we must determine whether there are any anomalies in the drugs he's taking, and if Gabriel has modified them, we'll need to speak with some of the medical professionals who are treating him. Keeping that strategy in mind, Lauren got up, and they both went to the room where anyone could be found. The hospital was almost deserted at that hour, which made it easy for them to transport the digital medical records that were kept there. Lauren entered the system without being seen, looking for Walter's file and going over his most recent medication minutes. Went by, and the tension increased as Lauren scrutinized every aspect of Andrew's observed the screen. In the hopes that something would be confirmed by Walter's suspicions here, Lauren whispered abruptly, her voice low but alarming, and Andrew leaned in to read it more closely. The information with her: Walter had been prescribed a number of drugs in the past 3 days that didn't match his initial diagnosis. When taken in excess, any of these medications may result in symptoms that could be mistaken for cognitive impairment, which would support a dementia diagnosis. Robert and Gabriel had been. It doesn't make sense that Lauren stated these things, but she wasn't careful enough. Drugs shouldn't be used to heal him because they are gradually weakening him, and if this keeps up, they may be able to defend legally disabling him. This appears to be deliberate, rather than merely a medical mistake. Andrew became enraged and worried. All of Walter's fears were materializing before their very eyes, and now it was up to him and Lauren to end it. "We must end this," Andrew stated firmly. "Yes, but we need more proof," Lauren retorted. "We can't use this alone to charge Gabriel and Robert if they must be collaborating with one of Walter's physicians because they are altering the medical records. If we can record a Andrew nodded. It was a hazardous strategy, but after their talk, we'll have enough to bring this to the authorities. Was all they had. They required concrete proof that Walter's family couldn't overlook or reject. Lauren and Andrew knew that Gabriel frequently went to the hospital, so they made the decision to act that night. They found out he had a meeting with one of Walter's doctors the following morning. After looking through the visitation logs, chose to conceal a tiny recording device among the medical records in the meeting room. This was risky action, but they were prepared to take the chance. As they awaited Andrew's return the following day, the anxiety in the air was evident. Remained at Walter's side, observing every detail and every staff member's entry and exit from the room. He was aware that every minute mattered, and Walter's destiny hinged on what he and Lauren could manage to do in the morning. Before Gabriel and the doctor met, Andrew and Lauren made sure the recorder was set up. The wait was excruciating. Every moment seemed endless, and Andrew, who was observing from the corridor, maintained and Lauren kept a watch on the door and the security cameras to make sure they hadn't been found yet. The meeting came to a close, and neither Gabriel nor the doctor knew what had as it happened. Andrew hastily got the recorder out, and Lauren listened to what was left on her computer. Gabriel, who was frozen on the recording, talked with a coldness that made it clear what he intended to do. He gave the doctor on how to keep undermining Walter by controlling the therapies and making sure the medical records showed. Gabriel stated, "I want the dementia diagnosis to be expedited because he is mentally incapacitated. Walter shouldn't be conscious for very long. His condition must deteriorate sufficiently for us to initiate legal action," and Robert was also active in the enterprise's control. Emphasizing the pressure, he felt the need to take charge before his creditors learnt the truth about his financial condition, and the whole strategy was outlined in that discussion. And now that Andrew and Lauren had the evidence they required, Lauren remarked, "We have it." I look at Andrew with a mixture of relief and worry, since this is more significant than I anticipated. Andrew acknowledged that they were up, but he also knew that what they had discovered could save Wall. Robert and Gabriel would do anything to obtain what they desired against a formidable foe. "We must take this to," according to Andrew, "the authorities are determined, but we must use caution. If they discover we are aware that they may do something even more drastic before we are prepared." Lauren concurred that they both understood that there was no space for error because Walter's life and legacy were at stake, and now that the proof in their possession, the actual battle was only getting started. And the day had come with an odd feeling of serenity. But Andrew understood that it was just the lull before the storm. After listening to the recording, he and Lauren realized how dangerous what had once been a simple situation had become. Suspicions had become indisputable, and Gabriel and Robert were putting together a careful plan to, if they didn't move quickly, Walter would become incapacitated, take over his businesses, and deprive him of everything he had built. Since the little audio clip they had was now their sole weapon, Walter could lose everything, even his life. Additionally, their biggest danger would be if Gabriel or Robert found out they were being videotaped. Not only would their lives be in jeopardy, but Walter's and Andrew were also well aware of the power, and the family's power could not be understated. And the morning went by with uncomfortably. Andrew carried on with his rounds, giving Walter and Ewinging the appropriate prescriptions. Even if everything was in order, doubt and impending danger seemed to cast a shadow over every face he encountered. As he made some adjustments to Walter's IV, Mr. Johnson Andrew inquired, "How are you feeling today?" "Better, thanks to you," Andrew Walter said, his face still showing signs of tiredness but with a slight smile. "However, I can feel time passing quickly." When Andrew heard those comments, he felt a knot form in his stomach since he knew Walter was correct. The situation was more serious than anyone could have predicted. Mr. Johnson Andrew tried to maintain his composure and say, "I'm doing everything I can to make sure everything works out. Walter, you're not alone." Nodded, but the latent anxiety in his eyes betrayed that of someone who knew disaster was approaching, but felt helpless too. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew Andrew was going above and above what a nurse should be doing. Thankful for the loyalty he had discovered in this stranger, something his own family had not been able to provide. Later, Lauren joined them, entering the room while trying to conceal her increased level of awareness. She had been going over the medical records and paperwork to make sure nothing had been overlooked. By the three, they exchanged a glance of comprehension. Walter already understood the situation, and no additional explanation was necessary. Fundamentals of the conspiracy against him, but it was time to escalate since we have proof. Lauren, hovering to Walter's bed and whispering, "That's enough to stop all of this, Walter," gazed at them both with relief and apprehension. "What are your plans for when?" he questioned in a barely audible voice. Andrew firmly replied, "We're going to the authorities, but we have to be cautious. Gabriel and Robert are strong, therefore we can't rush anything. If they discover we have this recording too soon, they might." Walter nodded slowly, understanding that his kids would do whatever it took to obtain what they desired. As he considered the potential reprisal, panic began to seep into him. He had attempted to emotionally detach himself. However, he realized how far they were ready to go after being confronted with the stark truth of what was happening around him. Walter inquired, "What can I do?" in an attempt to maintain some control over a situation that was spiraling out of control. In a supportive gesture, Andrew extended his hand and took it. Did not go unnoticed by the elderly guy. "Believe us, Mr. Johnson, we will take every necessary action to keep you safe, but I need you to be prepared for what's ahead. It won't be simple, and your family won't handle it." Walter took a deep breath as they realized they had lost control, and Andrew's comments were comforting, but they brought with it the truth of the tempest he was going to encounter, one that was full of revelations and treachery. Lauren took over the operation after she found a reliable attorney who wasn't influenced by Gabriel, and described the circumstances over the phone in broad strokes without giving away too much. They were both aware that they needed to move extremely carefully so as not to alert Gabriel and Robert. "I'll meet with Lauren," the attorney told them this afternoon, that I would give them the tape and go over the strategy. "May take many days, but we must act swiftly." Andrew nodded, appreciative of someone with the will and intelligence to manage such a delicate issue, like Lauren. By his side, realized that without her, they couldn't accomplish this. The afternoon stretched on, with each hour seeming endless to both. Andrew and Lauren kept a close eye out for any unusual activity, because they knew Gabriel and Robert might appear at any time, and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As night fell, Andrew was reviewing some files when his heart raced when he heard footfall entering Walter's chamber. They weren't the typical sound, they were swift and deliberate. After a usual visit, the door opened, and Robert and Gabriel entered tensely, both of them close behind. Their frustration barely covered Andrew's expressions, but he remained steadfast. Every ounce of his being was prepared to react to whatever situation might arise. "We must talk to my father," Robert commanded by himself, his icy gaze locked on Andrew, and Andrew had no option except to leave the room, but he remained just outside the door, paying close attention to everything he heard. Even though he couldn't be there in person, Walter would do all in his power to keep him safe because he was vulnerable. Inside, Gabriel remained in the background, watching as Robert approached the bed with a cunning look. Dad Robert's tone started out softer than usual, but he still had his usual manipulative attitude. "Walter wasn't duped. We must have a serious conversation. I've been considering your condition and what's going on with the companies. I believe it's time for you to decide before it's too late." Walter examined silently, understanding that everything his kids spoke was a component of a bigger plan. He knew Gabriel was there to oversee the procedure to make sure everything happened as planned. "I'm not sure what choice you're referring to." I forced Walter to respond while maintaining the most neutral tone of voice imaginable. "You can't do this alone, Dad. You realize that the businesses and your health are at stake. You're getting frustrated. Risk. You should delegate tasks to someone else. I can handle everything and ensure that there are no more issues." Walter's heart raced because he knew that this was the time he had feared, when his son, assisted by Gabriel, would attempt to, before Walter could react, take total control of his life and enterprises. With his typical icy, calculating tone, Gabriel intervened, saying, "It's for your own good. We don't want you to experience any more stress than is necessary, Mr. Johnson, but if you don't take immediate action, you may forfeit the words were a thinly veiled attempt to make any decisions at all. Andrew's muscles stiffened as he listened to the threat beyond the door. He knew Robert and Gabriel were making their last assault, but additionally, he was aware that their plan was about to fail because of the recording in the room where Walter was still cool, but on the inside, he was experiencing a mixture of despair and rage. It was heartbreaking that kids perceived him as a barrier rather than a parent, but he also felt more resilient than before, knowing that Lauren and Andrew were supporting him. "I'll give it some thought, Walter. I won't be rushed into any decisions," he said firmly. Robert and Gabriel exchanged a clear glance. They exited the room after saying their forced goodbyes, still not satisfied with Walter's reaction. Andrew left Walter alone and came back right away, his eyes full of concern. "Is everything okay?" Andrew inquired softly, and Walter gave a profound nod. Although he was aware that the threat had not yet passed, He now had something that gave him genuine hope. Realized that even if the fight wasn't done, Gabriel and Robert's strategy was going to fail. The tension in the hospital was evident, and Andrew couldn't help thinking about the fact that he wasn't alone anymore. Walter's last encounter with Robert and Gabriel, and how he was able to maintain his position under duress from his son and the dishonest attorney. But the danger persisted, and each minute felt like a countdown. They had the tape, but they hadn't made the last move yet. Andrew was doing his rounds in Walter's room as the afternoon wore on. Despite the seriousness of the circumstance, Walter appeared more composed than normal, as though the certainty had awakened something inside of him. That Lauren and Andrew fought to keep him safe. "You appear more at ease today, Andrew," noted that as he was adjusting Walter's IV. Walter briefly watched him to calm isn't the perfect term to describe his expression, but his eyes were filled with a profound sense of fatigue. "I'm better prepared, I've realized," Walter said in a horror but steady voice. "That I'm no longer terrified of what my kids did to hurt me, no matter what, more than any illness. Yet I've come to realize that they can't take away what I cherish most." Andrew's throat tightened at the words, "my dignity." Walter, a man despite being betrayed by his own blood, he mustered the will to stand and fight for his life. Knowing that the war that lay ahead with the door abruptly opened, and Beatrice, Walter's wife, came in with it, was unusual for her to visit, and her typical icy and aloof demeanor presence seemed to heighten the tension in the space. Beatrice remarked in an attempt at affection, but seemed hollow. "So we need to talk." Andrew nodded a little, getting ready to go. Offer them solitude, but Walter gestured for him to stay. "Andrew, regardless of my wife's words, don't have to be kept private." Beatrice gazed at him for a minute. Taken aback by the depth of his, she spoke through her words, not expecting him to respond so strongly. Gritting our teeth, "Robert and I have been discussing what's best for you, Walter. You're sick and can't continue to bear this burden. Please sign the paperwork we provided you. It will benefit everyone, and we don't want you to feel under further stress." Walter sighed deeply as he gazed at his wife with a mix of regret and contempt. "Beatrice, I've witnessed what you and Robert has been really interested for years, but you don't care about my welfare. Want me to sign those documents so that you and Robert may finally get rid of me?" Beatrice's expression transformed, losing for a split second. Her actual self, cold and cunning, came through as false calm. But she immediately covered it up with a lack of interest. "Don't be dramatic, Walter. You must acknowledge that you can no longer manage everything. We're not attempting to get rid of you. Assist you in overcoming this as well as possible." Walter shook his head, lowering his voice without even looking into her eyes. "Got stronger. You would support me for who I am rather than what I can offer if you genuinely wanted to help me." Andrew didn't say a word, but he listened intently, his heart racing, knowing that this exchange was Beatrice wasn't acting alone. She was merely a little component of a much larger plan. Beatrice remained silent, while Robert and probably Gabriel waited outside the hospital, planning their next course of action. She was momentarily uncertain of how to react, but after giving him a stern look, she got up and "Did as you wish, Walter. But you'll eventually have to decide since you're running out of time," she added. Andrew gave one last warning before leaving the room without saying goodbye, and as the door closed, he approached Walter. He had closed his eyes, exhausted from the encounter. It hadn't been a furious dispute, but every word had. "Are you okay, Mr. Johnson?" His emotional burden is weighing him down more than any medicine could. Andrew gently questioned Walter, who opened his eyes and gazed at him with the sorrow of a man who has lost the fight with his family before all of this began. "I'm exhausted, Andrew, from the sickness, yet it seems like they were never truly a part of my family. I can't keep acting like I'm surrounded by people who only see me as a trophy or a chance to advance. Doesn't affect me." Andrew sat next to Walter's bed, understanding that the elderly man wanted someone, not solutions. "Listen, I get it, Mr. Johnson, but Lauren and I are not alone in this. Would not allow them to harm you. You are no longer alone." Walter maintained eye contact for a considerable amount of time, in spite of the betrayal from his family. He had discovered something much more precious in Andrew's sincere devotion, and I know Walter mentioned that empathy was something he hadn't felt in a long time. It's weird, isn't it, that the person I trust the most isn't related to me. However, life has a peculiar way of revealing to us who truly matters, as demonstrated by a young man I've only known for a few months. Although Andrew knew the days ahead would not be easy, he nodded silently in gratitude for Walter's trust. With the recording in hand, they were one step closer to thwarting the scheme that Gabriel and Robert had devised. Lauren came into the room with a determined expression on her face at that very moment. Walter looking at both Andrew and Walter, she added, "We need to talk because I just found out that things are going to get more complicated. That Gabriel has been putting pressure on certain medical professionals to expedite Walter's diagnosis so they can proclaim him. Within days, he became legally disabled." And Walter listened to his expression with concern, but without he was shocked because he had always known that his family wanted this to happen as quickly as possible. "What should we do?" Lauren said, "We need to take the recording to the authorities as soon as possible," in response to Andrew's tense question. "We must also be prepared for what lies ahead, since Gabriel has already moved too many times to just sit back and do nothing. Pieces, and he might take dramatic action if he feels cornered." Walter listened in quietly, nodding slowly. Walter finally added, "This list is yours if you need to take. I have nothing left to lose. Do it, Justice." Andrew looked at each other, with Lauren, and nodded, aware that they were taking on a last-ditch fight against a family that would do anything to obtain what they want, knowing the next course of action because they had the evidence and were determined to keep Walter safe, was important, and will handle this. Mr. Johnson, Andrew firmly stated, "I won't let his darkness descended on the hospital." The three of them realized that Walter's next move would be the final one and decided to destroy you. The family had reached the pinnacle of its treachery, and now Andrew and Lauren had to make sure justice was served. Before it was too late, Andrew, Lauren, and Walter realized that everything was coming to a head at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The lawyers' meeting had gone smoothly, the tape was in good hands, and Gabriel and Robert were facing legal action. Had already started, yet everyone could sense that they had made significant progress. Given that the storm was only getting started, Gabriel and Robert weren't the type to wait for as a result of their behavior. There was a lot of tension in the hospital. Andrew looked over Walter's medical records once, further ensuring that everything was in order as Lauren worked with the authorities to determine what to do next. Would be carried out flawlessly. There was no space for error, because any oversight would allow Gabriel and Robert to demolish the proof or speed up Walter's demise. Walter was lying in bed. He knew that Andrew and Lauren were working tirelessly as he watched them do everything they could. He knew his family would stop at nothing to make sure their plan worked, but he also knew they could protect him. The hush when the door flung open, the room was shattered, and Robert rushed in first, his eyes full of rage and his mouth clenched. Gabriel trailed behind him with greater composure, although it was obvious from his tense stance that the recording had been made. More quickly than Andrew had expected, the authorities had arrived. "What do you think you can stop us with a bunch of lies, Walter? Do you think you can stop us from having a spat with Dad, Robert, without even bothering to be polite?" Didn't answer right away. Instead, he gazed at his son with a mixture of disappointment and regret, because he had anticipated this conflict, but it was made worse by witnessing it happen to Robert. His most trusted son now appeared before him as a stranger motivated by desperation and greed. "They are not lies, Robert," Walter calmly retorted. "I know you and Gabriel have been plotting to make me incapable of taking over my company, and you," Robert took a step closer, his face flushed with scarcely concealed emotion. "Controlled your rage, Dad. You have no idea what you're talking about, and this is only for your own benefit. You are incapable of managing things. You're no longer the man you once were. How can you be so blind?" Gabriel's normal poise pushed to Robert is correct, Mr. Johnson. Nobody is attempting to harm you. We only wish to make sure everything is in order for your own health. But it appears that you have chosen to put your confidence in the wrong individuals. Gabriel gave Andrew a menacing look as though his presence were the cause of all their issues. Andrew, who had kept quiet until that moment when they said, "I'm not the issue here. We have sufficient proof that you have been tampering with Walter's medical treatments, Gabriel. Purposefully undermining him. This isn't for his benefit. It's for your." Gabriel's tone was calm, but his expression clouded with greed, which is a very serious charge. "Andrew, watch what you say, since you don't know who." Andrew firmly said, "You're dealing with I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and the authorities now agree." Robert lost all self-control and made another step in the direction of his father. "Why are you doing this, Dad? Put your trust in a nurse rather than your own family." Walter gazed at him with grief in his eyes, "Since that nurse has done more for me than all of you have in your lifetimes. He has protected me, looked out for me, and never once considered me a methods to get wealthy, something that neither you nor your mother could comprehend." Robert became silent. He was shaking with rage since he hadn't anticipated hearing such harsh remarks from his own father, and for a brief minute he said, "Flatter, it wasn't just about the money, Dad, But Walter stopped him before he could finish. "Don't lie to me any longer. I know what you've done and what you're planning, and I don't want it," Robert Walter yelled, his voice trembling with fury. "Any other justifications? If you truly intended to assist me, you would be here for me, not for what you." Robert froze and was unable to reply, but Walter went on and spoke more, firmly but quietly. "All I've observed since arriving at this facility is how can you expect me to stay while Gabriel and Beatrix have planned to get rid of me? It's far too late, Gabriel, to trust you. Robert, it's too late." Decided to intervene again, this time in a more menacing manner, as the situation began to spiral out of control. "What, Walter, don't make any sense," he muttered, dismissively gazing at Andrew. "This is all just a mistake. There's no proof of anything." Lauren took out her phone, waited for the ideal opportunity, and played the recording for as Gabriel recognized his own icy, cunning voice. The tension between him and Robert increased dramatically. Lauren's cold voice begged the doctor to undermine Walter's proof. Robert went pale as he said, "As professionals, we have everything we need to prove what you've been doing and you can't escape it." Heard the tape and realized that Gabriel was going to ruin their whole scheme. Gabriel responded, "This won't end here," even though he was more composed and understood they had lost. "Despite your best efforts, you don't have enough power to ruin me. You can't play with me, Lauren, because I've been through this before and I know how to get out of situations like this." Andrew and he looked at one another, knowing that Gabriel had contacts and had dealt with challenging circumstances before. But this, Lauren told them that the authorities were already en route and that he wouldn't get away with it this time. "No matter who you know, Gabriel, you will lose Walter monitored because this is fraud, not just medical trickery." He hadn't wanted things to end this way, but he and his son were feeling both relieved and sad. He had lost his family long before this confrontation, and since that was all that was left, he realized it had been inevitable. Walter said forcefully to depart in front of the authorities in order to confront the truth. When he arrived, Robert started to object, but Gabriel took hold of his arm and pulled him towards the entrance he was familiar with. They left Gabriel with a final threatening statement because there was nothing else they could do. "Look at Lauren and Andrew, this isn't over." And then they vanished. There was silence in the hallway and the room, and Walter sighed deeply. And physically exhausted, but even though the fight wasn't yet done, he believed he had made a big step in the right direction. Independence Andrew moved towards the bed and put a comforting hand on Walter's. Andrew replied quietly, "Shoulder, we've made it through the worst part. The rest is up to the authorities." Walter nodded and briefly closed his eyes. He was worn out, but for the first time in weeks he felt as like he was regaining control of his life. Lauren also came over and smiled reassuringly. "Walter, you've shown a lot of courage." Walter opened his eyes and gave them each a small smile, saying, "It's going to be okay. Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you both." Andrew and Lauren looked at one another, feeling content that they had made this important step. They were aware that difficulties still awaited them, but the worst was over because they had dealt with Walter's family, and all would be settled quickly with the aid of the legal system. As darkness descended on the hospital, a new hope emerged. Walter, despite his physical weakness, was more resilient than he had discovered something that money could never purchase: devotion, surrounded by people who genuinely respected him. And on the surface, the hospital's atmosphere felt lighter due to Gabriel and Robert's sincere friendship. Yet immediately following the altercation, Andrew and Lauren were aware that the battle was still ongoing outside. The gray clouds that had enveloped Walter was worn out, but even though the city was starting to clear up during the day, the threat still hung over them like a shadow. As he lay in bed with a renewed sense of calm, his physical prowess was despite his limitations. His spirit was more resilient than ever when he confronted his family, and he had withstood their persuasion with Andrew and Lauren at his side. But he was aware of Gabriel refused to let things remain the same because the lawyer was always hiding something. And Walter couldn't afford to let his. Andrew was aware of this and kept in close communication with the authorities. Although the video provided reliable proof, they wanted to make sure there was no space for Gabriel's connections. Legal maneuvers that could have saved him. Robert, despite his lack of guile, was nonetheless a crucial figure in this web of treachery, and he would accompany Gabriel at every turn as the hospital hours went by. Continued in its typical cadence, with the buzz of equipment, discussions in the corridors, and the sporadic arrival of the tension that persisted in Walter's chamber, was framed by the nurses. Walter contacted Andrew quietly, hurried over to say yes. Mr. Johnson. Walter gave him a grateful glance and, "Hey, I want you to know that I'm at peace with whatever comes my way going forward. I never imagined that someone I I had no idea that you and Lauren would become my biggest supporters during such a trying period. I'm at a loss for words to express my gratitude." Andrew grinned, but his face was, "Since that was the correct thing to do, Mr. Johnson, you don't deserve what I did, so there's no need to thank me." Walter nodded and briefly closed his eyes, exhausted by the talk about what your family had done to you. He had to say something else though, "Because I've been considering my inheritance a lot, and I've decided that I want everything, and don't want my kids to get it because I no longer think they deserve what I created." Andrew glanced at him and said, "I have to be used to help others create something lasting, something that truly matters." Impressed by the choice, but he recognized that Walter had given it careful consideration. "Johnson, I'll do everything in my power to make sure your wishes come true." Walter grinned a little at that. He opened his eyes and gave Andrew a determined expression, saying, "I want you to be a part of it, Andrew. I want you to continue what I won't, because you are someone I trust, and you can help me make sure that what I do has a positive impact." Be able to finish Andrew, who was taken aback by the offer and said nothing for a few seconds, but then nodded in acceptance of the duty Walter was giving him. "I'll comply with your request, Mr. Johnson, and I'll do it with all the dignity you deserve." Lauren burst into the room, interrupting their conversation. "The authorities have arrived, Andrew, and they have begun questioning some of the doctors. Robert and Gabriel have been called to testify, but I have learned that Gabriel is attempting to destroy the medical evidence that implicates him, and he is manipulating the records by utilizing his connections in the hospital to make it appear as though Walter's care was flawless." The news arrived in the room like a bucket of cold water, but they were aware that Gabriel could do anything, and the fact that he was attempting to control the records demonstrated the extent to which he was prepared to go in order to preserve himself. "What do we?" Andrew inquired, obviously worried. "We need to move quickly," Lauren said. "I've already told the officers, but I'm going to speak with the head of hospital technology to prevent any unauthorized access to the records in order to ensure their security." "Access," Andrew nodded, his body tensing up again. The battle was far from done, and Gabriel was employing every weapon at his disposal. Andrew stated resolutely, "I'm coming with you," Lauren agreed, and both hurried out of the room, leaving Walter to sleep. But he was still conscious that his life and legacy were as Andrew and Lauren rushed through the hallways. Gripped in suspense, they already ran into the officers. According to hospital employees, the inquiry was in progress, but they required time, which is precisely what when they swiftly reached Lauren, the head of technology's office. Gabriel was attempting to steal from them. The head, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, described the scenario. He acted swiftly to prevent access to the medical records after realizing the seriousness of the situation. By protecting the backups so that no one can change them, everything is finished. The tech chief added, "Alter anything without our knowledge." Lauren let out a breath of relief, and Andrew nodded in agreement. Lauren remarked, but her tone remained strained, "Thank you, this gives us some time. Gabriel is determined to continue manipulating the system. Therefore, we must remain vigilant with the medical." After temporarily securing the records, they went back to Walter's chamber, where the elderly man gave them a slight smile. However, he could see by their facial expressions that everything was under control, even though the situation was still urgent. Walter asked in a shaky voice for the moment. "Yes," Andrew said, "but Gabriel isn't going to. He would stop at nothing to defend himself. But fortunately, the authorities are present and have already began looking at it." Walter nodded and closed his eyes gradually while processing. Walter stated that no matter what happens, they will be unable to conceal what they have learned. The hours stretched on, but as time went on, the web that Gabriel and Robert had created started to fall apart. Physicians who had been duped by Gabriel began to speak up, disclosing the pressures they had been under to change the medical records from Walter's treatments were unharmed, and the proof Gabriel had attempted to erase was at last secure. The news they had all been anticipating, that Gabriel and Robert had been arrested, arrived in the late hours of the night. Accused of medical record tampering, fraud, and breach of trust, nonetheless, justice was delayed. Andrew, Lauren, and Walter looked at one another with relief. They knew the fight had been difficult, but they had prevailed. Walter was safe, and when Andrew returned to Walter's chamber after the revelation of the truth, he discovered the elderly man awake, and with a calm expression on Walter inquired, "Is it true?" Andrew nodded with a smile, already knowing the answer. All over his face, "Yes, Mr. Johnson, we succeeded. Robert and Gabriel have been arrested. They are no longer able to harm you." Walter sighed deeply, closing his eyes as a single tear trickled down his face. but instead of feeling sorry, he felt a deep sensation of relief. As if the burden of years of treachery had finally, Walter mumbled, "Thank you," lifted. While Andrew sat at his side, holding in the same gentle tone, Andrew said, "Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for your hand." Until the very end. So in the darkness, Walter Johnson, despite being fatigued, he felt more alive than ever and knew that his legacy was safe. After losing his original family, he discovered someone far more precious who had taken care of and shielded him. Walter had won the most significant battle with Andrew and Lauren by his side without anticipating anything in return. Of his life, the struggle to maintain his honor, the revelation of Gabriel and Robert's arrests spread swiftly, and the hospital, which had previously been a quiet battlefield, started to resume its regular rhythm. For Walter, the environment in his room was completely different. His triumph over his family signified more than simply justice. It also signaled the end of a period of treachery, disappointments, and suffering that had at last ended. Andrew and Lauren, who was relieved but cautious, stayed by Walter's side to see that justice had run its course. But they were aware that Walter's mental burden from everything that had transpired would not go away quickly. The gray days that had followed him for so long were starting to give way as he lay in bed and looked out the window. Bright sunlight, yet the wounds on his heart would not go away quickly. Although he was aware that he had defeated Gabriel and Robert, the cost had been steep, in addition to losing his faith in his family, as well as any possibility of mending his differences. Even with his son and Andrew, Walter described the family ties of his son-in-law behind bars as softly pulling. Andrew, the young nurse in his thoughts, hurried over and sat down beside him. "Yes, Mr. Johnson," Walter glanced at. Despite his solemn demeanor, Andrew noticed a little sparkle in his eyes that he had never noticed before. It looked like a piece of him had found serenity, in spite of all the pain. "I've been," Andrew nodded, paying close attention as he reflected about his future plans and what he would do with the remainder of his life. Realized that, although the route wouldn't be easy, this phase of Walter's life was an opportunity to start afresh. "I've made the decision to give the majority of my wealth to charities," Walter added. "I don't want the money I made to be used by others to do what my kids did. Instead, I want it to assist people who actually need it." Andrew admired him, knowing Walter was a powerful man, but it took a great deal of guts to make such a choice after what he had gone through, which is admirable. "Mr. Johnson," Andrew stated, "I'm sure your legacy will help many people." In reference to Walter grinned a little, but his eyes showed the weariness of someone who had experienced more than anyone should, including you. "Andrew, I want to give you something extra, something unrelated to money, and I want you to assume responsibility for carrying on what I'll be unable to finish. But I want you to continue helping those in need the way you helped me." Andrew was briefly silent in response to the plea. He had devoted his life to helping people, but he never thought, "I'm at a loss for words when someone entrusts him with something so important." Still analyzing Walter's suggestion, "You don't need to speak." Walter smiled and said, "Just keep taking care of others like you always have. If I've learned anything, it's that the impact we make on people's lives and on you, Andrew, is more valuable than money or other possessions. Possess that gift." Andrew's throat tightened. Walter's remarks were impactful, "And I'll do it, Mr. Johnson." Andrew, at last, coming from a guy who had shed nearly everything but still carried extra weight, stated in a passionate voice, "I swear I will." Soon after, Lauren came in with the welcome news that the case against Robert and Gabriel had moved forward without issues. The proof was indisputable, and both received lengthy sentences, even though Robert in his desperation had attempted to bargain for his release by placing the blame on Gabriel. "But there was no way out of the justice is on our side," Lauren assured Walter, adding that everything would eventually be all right. Walter nodded to the side, yet his expression was a mixture of relief and melancholy. Understood the value of justice, but it didn't make up for the loss his children had caused him. As a father, there was no more grief than losing his children to heart corruption rather than death. Justice is required, but it doesn't always provide comfort, Walter said. "I'm still their father despite everything, and that's what hurts." Lauren, who realized that even though she looked at him with sympathy, the emotional scar left by Walter's stopping the plot against him was severe. "Walter," Lauren whispered, "you don't have to carry that guilt. Sometimes justice wasn't enough to ease the soul's suffering. They made their decisions, and you acted morally. We have no control over other people's behavior, only our own." Walter nodded, gently admitting that what she had said was true, but understanding that the void in his heart would not go away that quickly. He concluded by saying, I suppose time will take care of that. The days that followed saw a decline in hospital visits, and Andrew and Lauren continued to look after Walter as the legal case against Gabriel and Robert proceeded. But the feeling of danger had subsided, and it seemed as though things were going back to their weird new normal, where Walter one afternoon, although being physically weak, he discovered an inner calm that he hadn't experienced in a long time. As the sunshine, Walter made a final call to Andrew and Lauren via the hospital's windows, knowing that my time was running out. In a brief statement that startled them both, Walter stated, "I'm ready. I'm not scared of what happens next. Just before I leave, I want to make sure everything is in order." Andrew and Lauren looked at each other, recognizing that they understood Walter's meaning and that, despite the grief of losing him, he was Lauren. "You have nothing to worry about," as you dignify yourself for that moment, stated that everything is under control while sitting at Walter's side, and you've accomplished more than anyone could have. And your Walter grinned contentedly, which is what I wanted to hear when Andrew moved. Taking Walter's hand in a quiet show of solidarity, he was aware that the end was imminent, but also understood that Walter had closed his eyes and muttered, "Thank you both, I couldn't have done it without you." He had finally achieved the serenity he had always craved. And so, Walter rested peacefully in his bed as the sun sank. In the company of those he trusted most, he had triumphed in the most difficult battle of his life, not just against his family, but despite the sadness that persisted, against the gloom that had encircled him for so long. Walter departed with the knowledge that he had left a legacy that was far more significant than any wealth, love, trust, or dignity that in the days had become more subdued since Gabriel and Robert were taken into custody. But death would always triumph. Andrew and Lauren sensed that a new chapter was beginning as the hospital was no longer a battleground. Walter had discovered the he longed for tranquilly, and even though his body kept deteriorating, his spirit remained strong. The storm had passed, but the serenity it brought was filled with reflections and goodbyes to Andrew, who had supported Walter at every turn. This challenging trip revealed that the elderly man was gradually deteriorating. The days were getting shorter, and the discussions were getting more in-depth. As the end drew nearer, Andrew experienced a mixture of appreciation and melancholy, realizing that he had participated in a pivotal period in Walter's life. Assisting him in regaining his honor and confronting his nonetheless, Walter requested to meet Andrew and Lauren in his room one afternoon despite his physical infirmity. He appeared more active than he had in days, as though something within of him had roused. The two people warily entered, noting Walter's serene appearance. "Wish to discuss the next steps with you," Walter started off in a gentle yet forceful tone, "not only for me but also for the two of us." Lauren took a nearby chair and listened while you, Andrew, sat by the bed. "I've been carefully considering what will happen after I pass away, and I am aware of the choices I've made regarding although inheritance will have a big influence. I also realize that I can't do this by myself, because you two have grown beyond you, have become my family, my carers, and I want you to carry on my legacy, rather than Andrew and Lauren. Not just with the money, but also with deeds that have the power to transform lives." Looked surprised at each other, knowing that Walter trusted them. But the seriousness of what he was saying was Mr. Johnson. Andrew's voice trembled as he said, "We don't know what to do. Remark that what you're suggesting is enormous." Walter grinned, warmth radiating from his face. "I want you to know that I fully trust you both and that I don't expect you to answer straight away. Lauren, do amazing things for people who really need it, not just for me." Always practical yet inspired by Walter's remarks, "We will respect your requests going forward, not because we are in charge of your inheritance, yet we've witnessed both the greatest, because we firmly believe in what you stand for, and worst in people, and we've learnt more from your strength than you could have ever imagined." Walter nodded contentedly. Their reaction, he was aware that he didn't have much time, but he also understood that with Andrew and Lauren at his side, his mission to transform his suffering into something worthwhile would not be abandoned. The days that followed were devoted to arranging Walter's personal and legal affairs, even though his will had previously been along with the majority of his wealth going to nonprofits. He also made sure that Andrew and Lauren would be in charge of overseeing particular projects that he wanted them to carry on with the assistance he had begun. People who didn't have the same possibilities to help people like him had their closest loved ones betray them. Andrew and Lauren were a little taken aback when Walter asked to go outdoors to the hospital garden one morning. Request assisted him in getting onto a wheelchair. Walter appeared resolute despite his weakness. He realized he didn't have much time left, but he wanted to make the most of his final interaction with the outside world. The garden was in full flower, and it was time to say farewell to life with serenity. There was an unexpected serenity in the air as the trees swayed gently in the breeze and birdsong filled the room. Walter took a deep inhale, as though you're trying to take in every single element of the moment. When I was younger, Andrew Walter broke the stillness and remarked, "I never dreamed my life would finish like this. I always believed that money and achievement were the only things that mattered, but in these final days, I've come to realize that's not the case." Andrew sat next to him, and I'm sure you've made an impression. What matters are the people in your life and the connections you build. On more people than you think, Mr. Johnson. Your legacy will extend beyond the initiatives you wish to see completed. But Walter nodded, observing the breeze and the lives of everyone you touched. Move the tree's leaves, I hope, since I want to be remembered for what I did with my money, rather than merely for my financial gain. Rely on you two to assist me in making that happen. Lauren, who had been watching from afar, approached and put a hand on Walter's shoulder. We'll do it with all of our hearts, Walter. The afternoon went by, and despite his infirmity, Walter relished every moment in an almost unreal state of calm. Beautiful garden, as though he wished to transcend all thoughts and emotions anchored in the surrounding earth for himself at that very instant. It was more than just a goodbye. It was the end of a cycle of highs and lows, with difficult yet essential then the following day. Walter requested Andrew to assist him in writing a letter that went beyond merely using legalese. I want to write something in his will that reflected his feelings and what he had discovered in his father's last days. Something for my kids, Walter stated while gazing up at the ceiling, not to beg for or grant forgiveness. I simply, even if I no longer have optimism that they would learn, I still want them to understand what life is all about. Andrew took a seat next him, holding a pen and paper, and Walter started to, "Yes, darling kids. I understand that the decisions you've made haven't led to the outcome you anticipated or the one I desired. Caused me a lot of anguish, but I don't want to use this letter to accuse you of doing something that you didn't do. Want you to realize something. Before it's too late in life, material possessions aren't what really count. However, what we leave behind, and I'm not referring to cash or real estate, about the relationships we form, the people we assist, and the lives we touch, things that no amount of money can purchase or fill. The meaninglessness of living a life solely for oneself, and I fervently hope that you learn to see beyond wealth and power, and discover something greater than ambition in your lives. Perhaps you'll at the end, your father." I found serenity. After composing the letter, Walter Andrew felt both relieved and sad, since he had spoken what he needed to say, and even though he wasn't sure whether his kids would ever comprehend, he had fulfilled his responsibility when he gave the letter to, with a calm expression he hadn't worn in a while. Andrew Walter lay back in his bed and closed his eyes. They weren't aware of it at the time, but he sighed deeply and said, "I think I'm ready now." Walter had started writing his farewell letter, which was not only for his kids, but also for himself. Closing an embrace of the calm he found at last, but also a farewell to a life full of hardships, discovered that the hospital was silent. It was a chilly morning with moonlight, flowed softly through Walter's room's windows, where Andrew and Lauren had been spending the previous few weeks. Walter was aware that his time was running out because the elderly guy had gradually but calmly deteriorated over the years. Having accepted his fate, Walter had prepared his legacy, his fortune, and most importantly, the Andrew sat next to his bed and tenderly held Walter's message, which he so urgently wanted to share with everyone around him. Lauren, holding his hand, watched serene constantly despite her intense inner anguish, because they understood the time of, although it was time to say goodbye, they also knew that Walter would depart peacefully, as he had discovered what he was looking for in the room, fell silent as Walter opened his eyes and looked at Andrew, marking the end of his days of tranquility and dignity. His barely audible voice affected Andrew as he said, "It's time, isn't it?" With a slight smile, nodded gently, "Yes, Mr. Johnson, but don't worry, we're here to support you." Walter exhaled deeply, and he briefly closed his eyes as though getting ready for what was about to happen, and his countenance showed no signs of fear, but rather a sense of "Thank you, Walter." Serenity was someone who had done everything in his power to leave the world in a better state than when he found it. Remarked in a feeble but appreciative tone, "Thank you for being with me." Until the very end, Lauren came around to the opposite side of the bed and touched Walter's arm. "You don't need to thank us, Walter. It has been an honor to be with her." Her expression displays a mixture of sadness and sympathy, Walter smiled slightly despite his physical weariness on this voyage. It was apparent that each breath became more difficult. But his thoughts stayed clear. For the final few, it had taken weeks to battle not just his illness but also the ghosts of his past. But in the end, Walter muttered, his eyes still closed, "I found what I needed. Achievement or wealth, but more importantly, Andrew and other people I can trust." Lauren looked at each other, both of them fighting back tears since they knew the end was coming. However, they also understood Walter was prepared to leave. "So we will continue your legacy, Andrew. What you've done and what you've left behind will live on through us," he continued, his voice breaking with emotion. Walter didn't answer right away. His breathing slowed, but he still had a smile on his face. He was aware that his last remarks weren't required, because the relationship he had developed with Andrew and Lauren was self-evident. After his duty was finished, the hours went by calmly and quietly. As the dawn light started to, Walter breathed out one final time. His hand in Andrew's relaxed, and as Andrew closed his eyes, as his serene expression demonstrated that he had finally found the redemption he had long sought. He shed a secret tear, knowing that Walter had passed away, but he had done so in peace, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for him. Lauren placed a reassuring hand on Andrew's shoulder and murmured, "He's passed." However, he passed away quietly, and Andrew nodded, too moved to say anything. Despite the grief of loss there, he knew that this moment would come, but it was something else entirely. Walter had a great sense of thankfulness because he had discovered what he was looking for, and that was what really counted. In the days that followed, Andrew and Lauren were involved in a flurry of legal matters and emotions. In order to make sure everything was in order, the executor of Walter's wishes met with the solicitors. Because Walter had given explicit instructions that the majority of his assets should go to charities that help the most disadvantaged, such as hospitals, schools, and homeless shelters. But his legacy was more significant than his wealth because of the way he had impacted Andrew and Lauren's and others' lives. Made certain that the initiatives and foundations Walter had envisioned were implemented, it was their method of carrying out his purpose and turning the suffering and betrayal he had experienced into something constructive that would assist others. One of the first initiatives they launched in Walter's honor was a facility for senior citizens in need. Circumstances Andrew, assisted by Lauren, managed every aspect to guarantee the center not only offered health care, but also a location where individuals may find support and camaraderie during their last. Walter had cherished it for years, and on the day of the opening, Andrew, a feeling of satisfaction filled his chest as he stood in front of the building and watched as people started to enter. Contentment that exceeded any personal accomplishment, and he was certain that Walter would be pleased with their possessions. Lauren, who was standing next to him, slapped him on the shoulder and said, "We've done good work, Andrew." Andrew nodded while examining the notice on the wall, and Walter would be pleased to see this entrance with Walter's name on it. Yes, he would be, he said, his smile showing both sorrow and thankfulness. Walter Johnson's legacy was more than simply keeping his wealth or enterprises, but making a significant and enduring difference in people's lives. And despite the fact that his biological family had deceived him, he discovered something much more significant. And Lauren and Andrew, who had stood in the weeks after the center's opening, Andrew and Lauren planned to be by his side whenever he needed them. A brief ceremony to bid Walter farewell in the hospital garden, where he had requested to be remembered. They paid a silent homage in the place where he had passed away, surrounded by flowers and the gentle sound of the breeze. Looking around, Lauren remarked that this garden was his favorite spot in his memories. Discovered the item he was looking for, and Andrew nodded while holding a N. Yes, he wanted to be here. Andrew carefully dispersed Walter's ashes among the flowers, allowing the wind to blow through them, bring them away gently. It was a straightforward yet meaningful farewell. Just like Walter had. As the ashes mixed with the ashes, Andrew said, "Goodbye, Mr. Johnson." Lauren touched Andrew and said, "Thank you, Earth, for everything you taught us." Shoulder, and they stood silently together, observing the final traces of Walter's ashes as they floated away. On the wind, there was only thankfulness and tranquility instead of sorrow. As they left the garden, they both realized that Walter had had a profound influence on their lives and the lives of many others. Realized that even though Walter was no longer with us physically, his legacy will endure in every. He had been more than simply a patient. He'd been a friend and mentor in every life they touched. It ultimately a source of inspiration for both of them. So as the sun began to set, Walter's circle closed. Although Johnson was no longer with us, his legacy of kindness, generosity, and dignity will live on through those who sincerely loved him, and we appreciate you sharing this touching tale with us. If you were touched or motivated, remember to like, subscribe, and click the bell to receive more stories, redemption, hope, and life lessons. Sometimes the greatest legacy, though it isn't material, we can leave the individuals we come into contact with. I hope to see you in the next video.